At my husband's funeral, my daughter stood up and thanked the woman who replaced me. The room fell silent. I was seated 2 rows from the front, wearing the same navy blue dress I had worn to our 20th anniversary dinner. It no longer felt like a symbol of love, just outdated loyalty stitched into fading fabric. My fingers were trembling, but not from grief. Marissa stood at the podium, graceful as always, her voice steady and calm. She looked straight ahead and said, "There's one person who truly stood by my father during the hardest chapter of his life. Someone who gave him strength, comfort, and the love he always deserved." I swallowed hard. My heart thudded louder with each passing second. "She's more than just a friend," Marissa continued. "She's family, Veronica Hale. Thank you for loving my father the way he needed to be loved." Applause. Yes, actual applause. People turned toward the front row, where she sat in her pristine black silk dress, a diamond teardrop necklace resting over her collarbone, and the faintest, perfectly placed trail of mascara down her cheek. Veronica. The woman who had quietly become the center of my husband's world, and apparently my daughter's too. And me? I sat among the background extras, the wife of 38 years, the mother who missed holidays to help with school projects, who stayed up through his illnesses, who sold her piano to pay for Marissa's law school. Not even a glance. When the lawyer later read the will, I was already numb. The entirety of the estate, he said, voice flat, including the main residence, the coastal home, and the financial accounts, are left to Ms. Veronica Hale. No one gasped, no one cried. It was as though they already knew, except me. Marissa leaned over and gave Veronica a soft, grateful hug. Then they both smiled, not cruelly, but with the smug serenity of women who believed they had already won. That's when I stood up slowly. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin envelope. "There is another will," I said, "signed, dated, and legally binding." The room froze. Veronica's smile faltered for the first time. And that was the moment, right then, in that sterile lawyer's office with the scent of polished wood and betrayal, that I realized my story didn't end when Charles died. It began there. He thought he'd buried me in silence and ceremony, but I wasn't going to stay buried. Not anymore. The morning of Charles's funeral, the sky was cloudless, unnaturally clear, as if the universe itself had decided not to mourn him. I had expected rain. I had even welcomed the idea of thunder, something violent and unrestrained to match the storm inside me. But instead, the world carried on as though nothing had happened. The church was full. He was well known in our town. Charles Gray, the visionary architect who redesigned half the riverfront and left his name engraved on public plaques. People came dressed in respectful shades of black and navy. There were city officials, old clients, former interns. Even the mayor sent flowers. It was exactly the kind of farewell Charles would have wanted. Elegant, tasteful, and entirely built on appearances. I stood by the entrance greeting guests like a concierge, shaking hands with people I hadn't seen in years. I kept my posture perfect, my voice steady. "Thank you for coming." He would have appreciated it. No one could see my jaw clenched beneath the layer of foundation. I had practiced the expressions in the mirror, composed, grateful, loyal. Everything about that day had been curated to reflect the life Charles wanted the world to believe he had lived. A life of success, of honor, of family. But behind the black silk ribbons and calligraphed memorial cards, there was rot. And I was the only one who could smell it. Then she arrived. Veronica Hale stepped into the chapel without hesitation, as if she belonged there. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor. She wore a tailored black coat cinched at the waist with a velvet belt and a small netted veil that draped just enough over her eyes to suggest mourning without messiness. Not a single strand of her auburn hair was out of place. The woman knew how to make grief look like couture. A few people turned to look. She greeted them with brief, somber nods, a faint smile that said, "I've suffered too." And just like that, she took her seat, in the front row. My seat. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. No one told her to move. Marissa slid over without a word to make space. It was as if a quiet agreement had been reached behind closed doors. Eleanor may have been the wife, but Veronica was the legacy. And I? I was a living ghost, haunting the pews. After the service, while mourners filtered out of the chapel murmuring about what a visionary Charles was, I remained seated. I watched Veronica accept condolences as if she were the widow. Gracious, delicate, slightly trembling. A woman who knew exactly when to smile and when to let a tear roll down without ruining her mascara. Marissa stood beside her like a daughter supporting her mother. My daughter, my blood. And yet in that moment, I felt like a stranger watching a play. Except the play was my life, and somehow I had been recast without warning. Eleanor, someone said behind me, and I turned to see Margaret Langdon, one of Charles's oldest clients. She leaned in close. "You're holding up so well," she whispered kindly. "I must say it's generous of you, letting that woman sit up front." I blinked. I didn't let her. She just did. Margaret gave a sympathetic nod, but the pity in her eyes was unmistakable. "Well, it's all just so complicated, isn't it?" No, I thought. It wasn't complicated. It was betrayal, carefully curated and socially accepted. Back home, the silence was deafening. The coat I'd worn still smelled faintly of the church, lilies and candle wax. I peeled it off and hung it by the door, staring at the empty hook where Charles's jackets used to be. The hallway looked wrong without them, like a sentence missing its last word. The reception was scheduled for the following afternoon at our home. My home, the one now legally left to another woman. Veronica would be attending, of course. So would Marissa. They had arranged it all through text messages, ceasing me only out of obligation. I wandered into the kitchen and opened the fridge out of habit. 3 bottles of his favorite mineral water sat on the second shelf, untouched. I shut the door slowly, as if anything louder might shatter me. Then I noticed it. A note tucked into the frame of the pantry door. Charles's handwriting, slanted, precise. The ink slightly faded. It read, "Pick up Veronica's wine for Thursday. She likes the Merlot from Argent Cellars." It was dated 2 weeks before his death. There it was. A scrap of proof. Something small, yes, but tangible. A thread that confirmed what my gut had known for years. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had replaced me, emotionally, physically, legally. And everyone else had gone along with it. That evening, I walked through the house as if I were a guest in someone else's memory. Every room looked exactly as it had for years, yet nothing felt the same. His favorite chair by the fireplace, the books he never finished reading, the old record player he insisted on keeping, even though we hadn't danced to music in over a decade. The house was still full of him, but I realized now it was also full of who I used to be. I walked into the study, a room I had cleaned weekly but rarely entered otherwise. The curtains were partially drawn, allowing late afternoon light to spill across the desk in golden strips. His things were still there. His pens, his architectural sketches, his glasses folded neatly beside an old notebook. I sat down in his chair for the first time in years and opened the notebook. It was a ledger, not the kind he used for work. This was personal. Dates, addresses, brief notes. Some were innocuous. Meeting with Dean Thursday, but others. V dinner at Del Mar. Check cleared for V's retreat, Aspen. Deposit to V's account March 15th. Page after page. V. Veronica. The financial betrayal hit me harder than the affair. I had budgeted grocery lists to the dollar. I had skipped vacation so Marissa could attend private school. I had worn the same winter coat for 6 years, while Charles gifted Veronica ski retreats and fine wine. Suddenly I saw it all for what it was. Not just infidelity, not just dishonor, but a reallocation of my life, my sacrifices turned into someone else's luxury. And the cruelest part? He hadn't even tried to hide it. Not really. Maybe he thought I wouldn't notice. Or that if I did, I'd stay silent, like I always had. I looked around the study and saw the layers of my own erasure. Framed certificates from his career, awards, letters of thanks from clients. There was only one photograph of me in the entire room. Our wedding portrait, placed in a corner, half covered by an award for lifetime excellence in civic architecture. He had buried me long before the funeral. That night, as the sky darkened beyond the window panes, I sat at the kitchen table, alone. No footsteps creaked overhead, no clink of ice in a glass down the hall. Just me, the hum of the refrigerator, and the slow, methodical beat of a heart starting to awaken from sleep. I had spent my entire adult life smoothing over chaos. I had silenced my doubts, masked my loneliness with duty, and held my family together like the last beam in a collapsing house. But now the collapse was complete, and I was still standing. I stared at a framed photograph of our family taken 20 years earlier. Marissa, gap-toothed and wild-haired, sat between us. Charles had his hand on her shoulder, and I was leaning slightly forward, as if subconsciously pushing myself into the center, trying to hold us all together. I picked up the frame, studied it, then placed it face down. Then I opened my laptop. At first, my fingers hesitated over the keyboard. It felt strange, typing his name not to support him, not to celebrate him, but to investigate him. Charles Gray, architecture firm, partnerships, consulting reports. I clicked through links, searched old newspaper mentions, client announcements, and then I typed another name, Veronica Hale. The search results were modest. A few professional listings, one article mentioning her as executive coordinator to Charles Gray, and then a real estate transaction, a coastal condo registered under her name, purchased 4 years ago, fully paid. The agent listed? A contact from Charles's firm. I copied the link, saved the record, and stared at the screen. The facade was cracking, and behind it there was something far uglier than just an affair. There was something I could fight. I wasn't ready to fall apart, not yet, because something inside me, something long buried under wedding vows and compromise, was beginning to rise. It was quiet at first, just a whisper, but it sounded a lot like, "Not this time." Long before I became the woman sitting alone in a hollow kitchen, I was Eleanor Morris, JD, an ambitious litigation associate at one of the toughest firms in Chicago. My hair was shorter then, clipped to the chin, my heels higher, my voice sharper. I drank coffee black and went to bed with spreadsheets in my head. I wasn't someone you ignored. And then I met Charles Gray. He was different. Not just handsome, although yes, he was that too. But calm in a way I wasn't. While I moved through life like a storm chasing deadlines, Charles was still water. Steady, measured. He listened when I spoke, made space for my ideas, and never once interrupted me. That's what I remember first. The silence, it felt like respect. He was already making a name for himself in architectural circles, known for clean, modernist structures with emotional geometry, as one critic put it. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I liked the way he explained things. He made buildings sound like stories, layered, intentional, worth preserving. On our third date, he said, "I want to build something with you. Not just a life, Eleanor, but a home, a future." I believed him. Back then, I thought love looked like admiration, that the right man would see your strength and choose to walk beside it, not in front of it. And for a time, that's exactly how it felt. We were equals, partners. We debated politics over Thai takeout. He asked me about court cases. I asked him about zoning permits. We laughed more than we argued. But slowly and almost imperceptibly, the ground shifted. It began when Marissa was born. "You don't need to rush back to the office," Charles said one night as I rocked our colicky newborn. "Take your time. We can afford it. She needs you." I had planned to take 6 months off. I stayed home for 3 years. And when I returned to work, the momentum was gone. My old clients had moved on. My name no longer lit up any phones. My confidence, once rooted in long hours and wins in court, began to crumble under diapers, grocery lists, and middle-of-the-night feedings. "I'll take care of everything," Charles said again and again. "Just focus on the house, on Marissa, on us." So I focused. I planned birthdays, organized charity events, balanced the household accounts. I turned dinners into 3-course meals, and slowly, I handed him the map to my identity. He took it and redrew the path without me. The thing about surrendering pieces of yourself is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's not a dramatic slam of a door or a grand declaration of defeat. It's subtler, 1,000 small choices, made quietly, almost lovingly. I gave up weekend brunches with friends because Charles preferred to spend Sundays unplugged. I stopped coloring my hair when he said he liked the natural silver coming through. I even quit that part-time legal research job I had picked up after Marissa started preschool because he said, "We don't need the money, Eleanor. Why wear yourself thin?" At first I called it partnership. Then I called it compromise. Later I stopped calling it anything at all. I told myself it was love, but love shouldn't require silence as proof. The house became my domain, not out of choice, but out of habit. I curated every piece of furniture. I made grocery lists with surgical precision. I planned Marissa's education like it was a Fortune 500 investment. The more control I had over domestic life, the less I noticed how little control I had over my own. Still, I waited for moments. Crumbs of recognition. The way Charles used to look at me during dinner parties, the rare compliments, the warmth. But over time, those moments grew fewer. His eyes often glazed over when I spoke about anything unrelated to the household or Marissa. When I mentioned returning to law even part-time again, he gave a small laugh. Why? He said gently. You've already built a life here. Why tear it down just to chase deadlines again? I remember nodding. And then there was the scarf. It was silk, deep red with a faint gold trim. Found it in the glove box of his car when I borrowed it to drive Marissa to piano lessons. He told me it belonged to a colleague. She'd left it during a ride to the airport. Veronica Hale. It was the first time I heard the name. And I didn't question him, because part of me didn't want the answer. The second time I saw her was at Charles's firm's end-of-year gala. I remember the venue, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, champagne flowing like tap water, waiters in white gloves. Charles insisted we attend. It'll be good to show our faces, he said. I hadn't been to one of his work events in nearly 4 years. I had to borrow a dress from a friend because mine had gone out of style. Or maybe I had. When we entered, people greeted Charles like he was royalty. Handshakes, backslaps, reverent smiles. They looked at me with polite curiosity. A woman once known, now simply accompanying him. Then she approached us. Veronica. She was introduced as executive assistant and project liaison. Her handshake was soft but assertive. Her smile professional but warm. Too warm. Her dress was tasteful, black satin, high neckline, but the slit in the side danced when she walked. I've heard so much about you, she said, her voice smooth. Oh? I replied, matching her tone. I hadn't heard a word about you. She laughed, as if I had told a charming joke. Charles placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. Veronica's been instrumental this year, he said. I couldn't have survived that city contract without her. She tilted her head and smiled at him in a way that made something behind my ribs ache. I smiled too, tight-lipped, controlled. Later that night, as we sat in the car, I asked him casually, how long has Veronica worked for you? 3 years, I think, maybe 4, he said, loosening his tie. Why? No reason. I looked out the window. I didn't bring her up again. Instead, I tucked the feeling into the same place I kept all my quiet humiliations. Behind smiles at dinner parties, beneath folded laundry, between grocery receipts and school permission slips. Because the unspoken agreement in our marriage was this. He kept providing, and I kept pretending. And for a while, that worked. Until it didn't, it was subtle the way things unraveled. He stopped asking me to accompany him on business trips, stopped sharing his design sketches with me over coffee. Conversation shrank into logistics, what to buy, who to call, when the taxes were due. No more debates, no more ideas traded like currency between equals. We had become efficient strangers. One morning, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I found myself staring at the closet full of unused sheets and backup towels, wondering, is this my legacy? Organized linens, balanced budgets, quiet compliance. That's when it hit me. I hadn't just lost my career or my passion. I had lost the woman I used to be, and no one had stolen her from me. I had traded her. For comfort, for approval, for the illusion of permanence. Charles never had to ask me to disappear. I did it for him, one compromise at a time. And perhaps that's what hurt the most. Because when the will was read and I learned that everything, every asset, every home, every bank account had been transferred to Veronica, it wasn't just betrayal I felt. It was recognition of how carefully, how thoroughly I had been edited out of the story. Not overnight, not suddenly, but with the soft, practiced hands of someone who knew exactly where to cut. I invited Marissa over the day after the funeral. There were still lilies on the counter, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. Half-empty wine glasses from the reception cluttered the kitchen sink. The air smelled faintly of dust and leftover cheese platters. It was a house holding its breath, just like me. She arrived on time, as always. Marissa had inherited that from me. Punctuality, discipline, a hatred for chaos. She stepped in wearing a gray cashmere coat and navy pumps, her expression unreadable. I didn't think you'd want to talk so soon, she said, slipping her phone into her purse. I need to understand, I said, please sit. She chose the armchair across from me, not the sofa. The distance between us felt deliberate. I heard what you said at the funeral, I began slowly, about Veronica. Marissa didn't flinch. What about it? You thanked her, I said. You called her family. She was there for Dad when you weren't, she replied without hesitation. Her words struck like glass, sharp, sudden, and somehow rehearsed. I was his wife for 38 years, I said, my voice low. I raised you. I gave up my career, my independence, You gave up because you wanted to, she interrupted. You've told me that story 1,000 times, Mom. You chose to stay home. You chose to serve. Don't rewrite it now like it was a sacrifice you were forced into. I stared at her. Was this really my daughter? She continued. Dad told me a lot before he died about the loneliness, how you stopped seeing him, how you criticized everything he did. He said Veronica made him feel alive again. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the betrayal that crushed me. It was how casually she delivered it, like a closing argument in court, as if the judgment had already been passed. And you believe all that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She looked down for a moment. When she met my gaze again, her eyes were calm, cold. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw how he changed around her. He laughed more. He looked younger. He didn't walk on eggshells. I felt something crack inside me. Not a clean break, no, something slower, more painful, a splintering. I had come to terms with losing Charles, but I hadn't prepared to lose Marissa. The room felt colder than before, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Marissa sat with her legs crossed, immaculate and poised, like she was attending a deposition. I looked at her, really looked, and for a fleeting moment, I didn't recognize her. She wasn't the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap during rainstorms. She wasn't the teenager who sobbed into my shoulder the night her first boyfriend broke her heart. That girl had needed me. This woman across from me? She had made up her mind. I want to ask you something, I said quietly, and I want the truth. Marissa nodded once. Did you know about the will? Before it was read. Her silence was all the answer I needed. How long, I asked. She hesitated. A year. A year. I had spent that year decorating his birthday dinner, organizing his medications, watching his back stiffen with age. And she, my daughter, had known he had erased me from his legacy. Why didn't you say anything, I whispered. Because it wasn't my place, she said. Dad wanted to leave things to someone who understood him, who respected him. I didn't want to interfere. I stood up, the weight in my chest unbearable. You did interfere. You stood beside her at the funeral. You called her family in front of everyone. She is family now, Marissa replied, whether you like it or not. That's when the pain twisted into something else. Not rage, not despair. Something colder. Realization. You think I was weak, I said. You think staying, serving, sacrificing us makes me the fool. Marissa's expression didn't change. I think you built your life around him, and when he stopped needing that, you didn't know who you were anymore. The truth stung because in some ways she was right. But she wasn't done. You're trying to play victim now, she said, standing up and smoothing her coat. But Dad gave you decades. Veronica only had a handful of years, and she made him happy. I walked her to the door in silence. As she stepped out, she turned to me and said, "Don't make this uglier than it needs to be, Mom." And then she was gone. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that settles after a bomb has dropped, before the dust finishes falling. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was weeping. The tears had dried before dinner. What remained was something far more dangerous: clarity. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how long Marissa had been rewriting our family story in her head. Had it started when she went to college? When she began idolizing her father's elegance over my effort? Or was it when I began fading from view? Not because I stopped loving her, but because I stopped being the version of myself she could proudly explain to colleagues? I had spent years teaching her how to be strong, capable, independent. But somehow, she had interpreted my quiet sacrifices as weakness and Veronica's polished manipulation as strength. At dawn, I rose and walked into the living room. The air was still, my reflection caught in the darkened window. Hair loose, wrinkles etched around my eyes. A woman who had given everything and now stood with nothing. Except, that wasn't true anymore. Because now I had truth, and truth I was beginning to understand was power. I opened the bottom drawer of the hallway cabinet and pulled out the file folder I had started after the funeral. Notes, emails, screenshots, receipts, anything that didn't add up. I'd titled the folder Unfinished Business. At first, it had been just a place to collect the fog of betrayal. But now it felt like something more. Evidence. A roadmap. My hand stopped over an old photograph tucked at the back of the drawer. Marissa, about 6 years old, holding a paper crown we made together for her birthday. She was beaming. I was kneeling beside her, holding the glue stick, my other hand on her back. In that picture, she looked up to me. She had forgotten, but I hadn't. That morning, as the city woke up around me, I made a quiet vow. If they had rewritten me out of my own story, my daughter, my husband, his mistress, then it was time I took up the pen. Not to beg for a place, but to reclaim it. 3 days later, I saw Veronica again. It wasn't planned. I had gone to the florist to order a wreath for Charles's grave, more out of obligation than grief. As I stepped out, there she was across the street, standing beside her silver sedan, laughing into her phone. Her posture was relaxed, her sunglasses perched on her head like a woman enjoying spring. My blood ran cold. She didn't look like someone who had stolen a life. She looked like someone who had been given one. As if all of it, the inheritance, the sympathy, the approval, had been her rightful due. For a moment I considered walking away. But then I saw Marissa's words flash in my mind. She is family now. No. No, she wasn't. Not by blood, not by truth, not by honor. I walked across the street. She saw me, paused, then smiled. "Eleanor," she said, her voice sticky with faux warmth. "It's been a difficult time for all of us." "Spare me," I said. Her smile faltered. "I'm not here to argue," she replied, "but I hope you can find peace. Charles wouldn't want—" "Charles is dead," I cut in, "and I'm not here for peace, I'm here for the truth." Her face froze for just a second, just long enough, then came the tilt of her head, the mask sliding back on. "Truth is subjective," she said softly. "No," I said, "it isn't." And with that, I walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from defeat, but from the weight of awakening. The betrayal of a husband was devastating. The betrayal of a child was shattering. But the betrayal of myself? That was over. The day I met Naomi Trent in the old library cafe, I felt as though I had stepped out of my well-rehearsed role as wife and widow, and into territory I had not permitted myself to explore for decades. The air smelled like aged paper and heated coffee, the quiet hum of conversation around tall bookshelves like a backdrop to a scene I was just beginning to write for myself. Naomi, sharp-eyed and still quick-witted despite the years she had spent away from full-time work, tipped her glasses and offered me a warm nod. "Eleanor Gray?" she asked. "It's been a long time." "I suppose it has," I replied, smoothing the sleeve of my coat. "I came because I need help seeing what I couldn't see before." She leaned forward, the cafe light glancing off a thin silver notebook she always carried. "Tell me everything." So I did. The silk scarf in the glove box, the invitation to the gala, the front row seat at the funeral, my daughter's words, the note in the kitchen, the ledger in the study with scribbles and V, dinner at Del Mar, everything. Naomi listened quietly, letting the weight of my story settle between us. Then she asked, "What about the numbers?" I looked at her blankly. "The numbers?" "Yes, the transfers, the purchases, the things he didn't talk about, that house in Nantucket, the company shell accounts. Do we have any of that?" I swallowed. I found a record for a coastal condo under Veronica Hale's name. Purchase date 4 years ago. Fully paid. Agent listed. One of Charles's firm contacts. Naomi's eyes narrowed. "That's something. Let me access some archived financials. We'll need more." I nodded. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Agency, not just being acted upon, but acting. Over the next week, Naomi and I met twice more. We dug into public records, tax schedules, property registries, and old firm announcements. Naomi showed me how to request certain filings, how to cross-reference statements. She had kept a few contacts from her consulting days. One late evening, I sat alone in my study with the ledger Christopher Gray had left behind. I opened the pages to a section I had skipped before, Expenses, VH. Under it, I found a line, Pacific Retreat, Aspen, 061 FaxGax X1, $23,000. Beneath that, Corporate Consulting, Quint Consulting LLC, 031 Muxex Strauss 2, $50,000. My stomach turned. I had not just been sidelined emotionally. I had been erased financially. The money that should have been ours, our home, our future, our inheritance, had been rerouted to a name that wasn't mine. But even as I felt anger rise, a deeper emotion overpowered it. The need to know. Not just the what, but the why and the how. Because understanding was the foundation of justice. That night, I printed the evidence. Emails, screenshot of the title document for the Nantucket condo, bank transfers, the note from the kitchen. I laid everything out on the dining room table under the overhead light, like puzzle pieces scattered on a board. My hand hovered over a photograph of Charles and Veronica at a company event. His hand on her arm, his smile different than the one he ever gave me in the same room. It struck me. The betrayal had nothing to do with love. It had to do with planning, with purpose, with systematic removal. I leaned back, the chair creaking beneath me. I realized then, if I were to reclaim even a part of my life, I would need evidence. Not rumors, not whispers, proof, and I had started building it. The next time Naomi called, her voice was sharp, urgent, but not alarmed. "I found something," she said. "Come now, bring the ledger." Her home was a modest brick townhouse tucked behind ivy-covered walls, filled with the scent of strong tea and old books. She ushered me into her office, where her laptop screen glowed with spreadsheets. "Look here," she pointed. 3 entries from Charles's firm, listed as external consulting support. But the beneficiary address is registered to a shell company, Quint Consulting LLC. I leaned closer. "What's the problem?" Naomi tilted her glasses. "The company has no office, no team, no website, no invoices. It exists only on paper. And guess what name the payments were traced to?" I didn't breathe. "Veronica Hale," she said. She clicked the mouse. A document opened, a scan of a payment approval from Charles's signature 3 years ago. $48,500 listed under consultation services, project redevelopment. The line item had been buried between legitimate vendor payments, spread out over 5 years, Naomi added. I estimate over $350,000 funneled through that name. Quietly, just under the quarterly audit threshold. I stared at the screen. So that's what he did. He didn't steal from me. He redirected from the firm, from his partners, from the people who trusted him. Veronica wasn't just his mistress. She was his accomplice. Naomi looked at me gently. "You need legal counsel, not just emotional support. This is fraud." I nodded. My hand was steady now. My heart wasn't racing. The pain had settled into something more productive. Resolve. That night, I returned home and spread the new documents next to my old ones. I began organizing everything into categories: property, financial transfers, shell companies, personal notes. And then I pulled out something I hadn't looked at in years, an old USB drive labeled Eleanor Legal Archives. Inside was a folder titled Robertson and Klein, 2002, the law firm I once worked for. I opened it, scanning for templates, contract clauses, legal precedents. Not because I wanted to revive my old career, but because I had been trained for this exact fight. I just didn't know it would be against the man I married. I clicked New Folder. I named it Counterclaim Evidence Build-Out. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something like strength. Not joy, but the first brick of something solid beneath my feet. 2 nights later, as rain pattered softly against the window panes, I opened the last drawer in Charles's desk. It had always been locked. A slim brass key lay hidden beneath the study's floor rug, a place he likely thought I would never look. And truthfully, I wouldn't have. Not before all this. But trust had been buried beside him, and what remained was the quiet necessity of survival. Inside the drawer was a leather-bound journal, an old passport, a jewelry box, and an envelope marked in Charles's handwriting. "Do not open until September 23rd. That was my birthday. He never gave it to me. I held the envelope for a long time. My hands didn't tremble. I was past trembling now. When I finally opened it, I found a note written in ink and a receipt. The note said, "Eleanor, I wanted to give you something meaningful this year, something that reminded me of your strength, your patience, your ability to wait without breaking. You always said you loved sapphires even more than diamonds." I finally listened. Charles. Enclosed was a purchase receipt. 1 sapphire pendant, handset in platinum, price $4,200. Dated 3 years ago, never given, never mentioned. I checked the jewelry box beside the envelope. Empty. He bought it, wrote the note, prepared the gift, and then gave it to someone else. Veronica? No, that wouldn't make sense. Or maybe it would. Maybe the pendant was never meant for me at all. Maybe the note was a rehearsal or a lie. Insurance in case guilt ever made him want to give me a piece of what I had already earned. The part that broke me wasn't the gift. It was the acknowledgement, written proof that he knew I was strong, patient, loyal. And he still chose to betray me anyway. I placed the note back into the envelope and filed it under a new section in my evidence folder. Intentional concealment. I wasn't just gathering data anymore. I was gathering motives. Charles had planned all of it. Not out of love, not even out of hatred, but out of calculation. He wanted to give Veronica the full page, while I faded into the footnotes. But he had forgotten something. I still knew how to read between the lines. I met with Naomi one final time before contacting a lawyer. We sat on her back porch, surrounded by potted herbs and the early scent of autumn. A yellow notepad lay between us, filled with dates, amounts, property deeds, and names. She reviewed everything like a surgeon checking vitals before a high-risk operation. This, she said, tapping one of the bank entries, is your foundation. It proves not just financial misconduct, but pattern behavior. And with the timing, post-retirement during his illness, the court may see this as deliberate misappropriation. I took a breath. Do I have a case? Naomi nodded. You have a case, but more importantly, you have a voice. The only question is, are you ready to use it? I looked at the folder on my lap. Inside were over 40 pieces of documentation, cross-reference transfers, property records, personal notes, photographs, the letter from Charles, the jewelry receipt, even screenshots of Veronica's public posts where she mentioned the Nantucket home, our little secret hideaway. I'm ready, I said. That afternoon, I contacted Michelle Robinson, a corporate fraud lawyer Naomi had recommended. She had a reputation for precision and persistence. When I explained the situation over the phone, her tone didn't flinch. You've done the hard part, she said. Now let me help you build the rest. I emailed the documents that evening. The next morning, her office confirmed receipt. And just like that, everything shifted. I was no longer a grieving wife, no longer a forgotten mother, no longer a discarded woman in someone else's obituary. I was a plaintiff. I was a witness. I was, at last, the author of my own chapter. I never expected the second will to exist. Not really. It was the kind of hope you allow yourself in dreams, only to discard with your morning coffee. But once the evidence started to stack, I found myself thinking, what if he changed his mind? What if the man who stole everything still left a way for me to take it back? Michelle, my lawyer, had been silent for days after reviewing the files. When her number finally lit up on my phone, I braced for disappointment. Instead, she said, you might want to sit down. She didn't wait for confirmation. Charles Gray signed a will 8 years ago. It named you as the sole beneficiary, the primary residence, investment accounts, and both properties. That version was notarized. We have a digital record of the filing with the county, and a copy was stored in a secondary vault registered under your name. I couldn't speak. There's more, Michelle continued. 3 years ago, a new will was drafted, the one favoring Veronica. But guess what? There's no formal revocation of the earlier will, no destruction clause, and the newer document has technical weaknesses. The notary wasn't licensed in this state at the time of signing. My heart pounded. Legally, she said, we may be able to argue that the original will stands, and if we can prove coercion or undue influence in the latter version, it's game over for Veronica. I hung up, stunned. Then I walked straight to the bedroom closet, pulled down a dusty fireproof box, and unlocked it with shaking hands. Inside were birth certificates, insurance records, my old law license, and a sealed envelope labeled in Charles's handwriting. Stage, final copy 2015. I opened it with trembling fingers. There it was, the original will, my name on every line. No mention of Veronica, no hidden clauses, no exceptions. Just the life we had built, written down, recognized. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't for him. They were for me, for the woman who had believed, through everything, that she was invisible, that she had been erased. But this paper said otherwise. It said you mattered. He may have tried to revise the ending, but I had found the original draft. And now, I had the law on my side. Michelle's office was in a sleek glass tower downtown, all marble floors and quiet confidence. Her assistant led me into a conference room with a panoramic view of the city. A city my husband once shaped through steel and glass. Now I was here to undo the shadows he left behind them. Michelle entered moments later, holding a thin folder. We're moving fast, she said. We've filed an official petition to contest the second will and restore the first as legally valid. Based on what we've submitted, the probate court has granted us a preliminary hearing. When? I asked. 2 weeks. My stomach flipped. She noticed. I know it feels fast, but we want to catch them off guard. And you have what few people in your position do, Eleanor. Paperwork, originals, timelines, motivation. And what about Marissa? I asked, barely managing the name. Michelle paused. If she testifies on Veronica's behalf, it could complicate things emotionally. But legally, not much. She's not a named beneficiary in either will. Her opinion won't change the facts. I nodded. But it would change everything else. 2 days before the hearing, a formal letter arrived from Veronica's attorney. It was written in the kind of language that sounds polite but drips with entitlement. Our client maintains that Charles Gray's final wishes are clearly outlined in the most recent will, which represents his true intent. Any legal efforts to overturn this document will be viewed as distressing and unfounded. At the bottom, a request for amicable resolution. I didn't laugh. I forwarded it straight to Michelle. Desperation, she said. They didn't expect a fight. No, they didn't. They expected me to fold, to vanish with grace, to accept my place on the margins. But I wasn't here for revenge. I was here for correction. To fix the record, to take back the space that had been quietly stolen. To remind them and myself that I had never stopped being the legal wife, the legal heir, the woman who built a life while someone else just borrowed it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand chandeliers, no polished oak walls like in the movies. Just white paint, functional benches, and a faint smell of dust and copier toner. But the air was thick, like something sacred was about to be dissected under fluorescent lights. Veronica sat at the opposing table, perfectly composed in a navy suit with pearl earrings and a hard smile. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something she nodded to. She didn't look at me, but Marissa did. She was there, seated behind Veronica on her side of the aisle. She wore black, not in mourning, but in solidarity. Our eyes met for a brief moment. Hers were unreadable. The judge entered, female, mid-60s, stern. Good. Michelle stood to begin. Your Honor, we are here today to request that the original will of Charles Gray, dated and notarized in 2015, be recognized as the legitimate last testament on the grounds that the more recent version, dated 2020, was never properly executed and was potentially influenced by external parties. The judge glanced at both tables. Proceed. Veronica's lawyer argued first, calm, measured. Our client was Charles Gray's most trusted companion in his final years. He confided in her. She was present during his medical decline. It was only natural that his last will reflected the reality of his emotional world. Michelle responded smoothly. Emotions do not override legal processes, nor do they justify concealment of a fully notarized prior will that was never revoked. Then she slid the envelope across the table, the original will. Signed, witnessed, filed. Veronica's attorney stiffened. The judge leaned in to inspect the seal. You have the backup filing record? Michelle handed her a printed copy. We also have evidence of financial transfers between the decedent and Ms. Hale through a shell consulting firm during the final years of his life. This supports the possibility of undue influence. There was a pause, and then the judge turned to me. Mrs. Gray, you have the floor. I stood up, hands steady, voice calm. But inside, I was holding decades of silence, and finally I was ready to let go. I stepped forward and looked at the judge. My name is Eleanor Gray, I began. I was Charles Gray's wife for 38 years. I didn't read from notes, I didn't need to. I was there when he had his first heart scare, when his firm almost collapsed from a market crash, when our daughter broke her arm falling from a tree and he was out of town. I made the soup. I paid the bills. I cleaned the blood off the bathroom tiles when his nosebleeds became frequent. I was not just a wife. I was his witness. I took a breath. When he asked me to stay home, I did. When he told me I didn't need to work, I listened. I gave up my courtroom for his conference rooms. My resume faded while his reputation grew. I turned briefly toward Veronica, and when I saw another woman sitting in the front row at his funeral, in my place, I realized something. I had allowed myself to become invisible, but the law doesn't forget signatures, nor does it excuse manipulation disguised as companionship. I held up the original will. This document is not just ink. It's history, it's evidence, it's the truth. That I existed in his life long before I became inconvenient to his second one. The courtroom was silent. Even Marissa looked down. I turned back to the judge. All I ask is that you see what's written, not in emotion, but in fact. Not in whispered stories, but in records. I am not asking for vengeance. I am asking for recognition, for the truth to be restored, not just for me, but for every woman who gave too much, too quietly. The judge nodded once. Thank you, Mrs. Gray. She called a recess. As I returned to my seat, I felt something shift. Veronica no longer looked composed. She looked afraid, because for the first time I had spoken. The next day, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread. not in headlines, but through whispers. The widow is fighting back. The mistress might lose everything. Former colleagues of Charles, distant cousins, curious strangers. Even two journalists sat in the back row, scribbling in quiet bursts. Veronica arrived in a deep maroon suit, her hair pulled back tightly. She clutched a black folder to her chest like a shield. She didn't look at me. Marissa came in after her, slower this time, her eyes darting across the room before settling briefly on mine. Something had shifted. She didn't nod, but she didn't look through me either. The judge entered. We'll resume testimony. Michelle stood. Your Honor, today we submit into evidence an audio recording recovered from a backup device belonging to Charles Gray. The voice has been authenticated. It was recorded 1 year before his passing. Veronica's lawyer objected. This wasn't disclosed during discovery. Michelle didn't flinch. It was uncovered late in the process, under legal protocols, and it directly relates to the question of intent, the foundation of this case. The judge waved the objection away. Let's hear it. Michelle pressed play. At first there was just ambient noise, papers rustling, the hum of an air conditioner. Then came Charles's voice, low and unguarded. I know what I'm doing is wrong. I know Eleanor deserves more than silence, but I'm tired. Veronica makes me feel younger. Not better, just less old. A pause. But she'll never be Eleanor. That woman rebuilt my name from dust, paid off my debts, raised our daughter without once making me feel like a failure. She deserves everything I have, but it's easier not to face her. Veronica makes it easier. The courtroom was silent. No one moved. Then came the last line spoken like a confession. I don't love Veronica. I'm just hiding from the truth with her. The audio clicked off. Veronica's hands had gone limp on the table. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The entire room turned to look at her, not with hatred, but with something worse. Pity. Marissa stared straight ahead, eyes glassy. The judge adjusted her glasses. That recording confirms 2 things. 1, Charles Gray understood the distinction between comfort and commitment. And 2, he believed Mrs. Gray was entitled to his estate. That matters. Veronica's lawyer looked as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Michelle stood tall. Your Honor, we rest our case. But the case wasn't done yet. Because now Marissa wanted to speak. I'd like to say something, Marissa said quietly. The judge looked up. You're not a named party in this case, Ms. Gray. I know, she said, standing slowly, but I think I've been part of it anyway. Veronica stiffened beside her. Marissa, no. But Marissa was already walking to the stand. The room held its breath. She was sworn in. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, like a violin string pulled too tight. I grew up watching my father run the city, she began. He was admired, charismatic. People called him brilliant. I called him Dad, and I wanted to be like him. She looked at me briefly, but my mother, she was the one who built things no one applauded, the things that didn't get awards, the late-night meals, the quiet crisis management, the financial rescue when Dad's firm nearly went under. Marissa's voice cracked. I forgot that, she said, because I wanted to see strength as charm, as confidence. But strength is what stays, what keeps holding even when nothing is returned. Veronica's lawyer stood. Your Honor. The judge raised a hand. Let her finish. Marissa turned toward the courtroom. I knew about the second will. I didn't tell my mother. I justified it by saying it wasn't my place. But silence is a choice, and mine hurt someone who never stopped choosing me, even when it cost her everything. Tears welled in her eyes now. She looked at Veronica. I believed you, she said. I thought you made him happy. I thought my mother was old-fashioned, bitter. But that tape reminded me that people don't stop loving just because they stop saying it. Then she turned back to me. I'm sorry, Mom. The room was still. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I saw the daughter I had raised. Not the woman shaped by her father's narrative, but the one who had inherited my strength. The judge cleared her throat. I believe we've heard enough. Veronica slumped slightly, as if for the first time she knew. She had already lost. The judge leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers beneath her chin. She had listened to every word, from lawyers, from recordings, from daughters. And now she would speak. I have presided over many estate disputes, she began, her voice firm but not unkind. But few carry the emotional weight of this one. This is not just about documents and signatures, it's about intention, about what is fair, about what is owed, not in money, but in truth. She paused, eyes moving between me, Veronica, and Marissa. It is clear from the evidence presented, including the original notarized will, the absence of a legal revocation, the audio testimony of the deceased, and the patterns of financial misconduct, that the 2015 will reflects the authentic intent of Charles Gray at the time he was of sound mind and body. She turned to Veronica. The 2020 will, while newer, suffers from legal deficiencies and ethical questions that cannot be ignored. This court cannot in good conscience uphold it. Veronica's face drained of color. Marissa's head dropped, tears sliding silently down her cheek. The judge continued, voice unwavering. It is the ruling of this court that the estate of Charles Gray be awarded in full accordance with the 2015 will. All assets, financial, residential, and material, are to be transferred to Eleanor Gray as the legal and rightful heir. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing thud. Case closed. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I simply breathed, a deep, full breath that filled every corner of my lungs for the first time in years. It was over. Veronica stood, her hands shaking as she tried to collect her things. No one helped her, not even Marissa. The silence around her was heavy like the end of a long illusion. She glanced at me once, just once, and in her eyes I didn't see hate. I saw fear, because I had become something she never expected. Visible. Outside the courthouse, the sun had already dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the steps. The air was crisp, early autumn brushing the back of my neck like a quiet reminder. This is where something ends, and something begins. People filtered out, murmuring, dispersing. Reporters hovered near the exit, but no one approached me. They weren't after scandal anymore. The story was over, and somehow they knew it didn't belong to them. Marissa stood by the pillar near the sidewalk, her coat clutched tightly, eyes raw but open. I walked toward her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You were brilliant in there." I let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "You were brave." She nodded slowly, then looked down. I didn't understand. Not really, not until I heard his voice. The way he spoke about you. I didn't need his validation, I said gently, but I needed you to see me. She looked up, eyes wet. I do now, and I'm sorry. For every word I repeated without thinking, for every silence I chose when you needed someone to speak. There was nothing else to say. So I did what mothers do when the words run out. I opened my arms. She fell into them. The hug was quiet, but it stitched something that had been torn. And I knew it would take time. Trust wasn't a faucet you could just turn back on, but this wasn't the end of us. It was a beginning. That evening, I returned home to silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that haunted. It was the kind that cleansed. The hallway felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because I no longer carried the weight of absence. Charles's coats were gone. Veronica's shadow no longer hung in the corners. What remained was mine. All of it. I walked into the kitchen. The lights were off, but moonlight poured through the window, falling in soft silver stripes across the counter. The same counter where I had once laid out receipts, photos, and pain. Now it held something else, a simple envelope. My name, handwritten in blue ink. I opened it. Inside was a note from Marissa. "Mom, I know I can't undo everything, but I'd like to try. Sunday dinner? My place this time. Just us." I smiled. It wasn't just an invitation, it was an opening, a crack in the wall, a light down the hallway of something new. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside the drawer where the original will had once lived. Then I poured a glass of water, turned on the old jazz station, and sat down at the table. No need to rush, no one to serve, no face to put on. Just me, and it was enough. The war was over. But my life? It was just beginning. The first thing I did after the trial was change the locks. Not out of fear, not out of pettiness, but because I needed the symbol. For too long, I had left the door open to ghosts, memories, regrets, loyalties that no longer served me. Changing the locks was a declaration. This home now belongs to a woman who would never again apologize for occupying space. I donated most of Charles's things, the suits, the monogrammed cufflinks, the Italian shoes he polished religiously but barely wore. I kept one photograph, a black and white image from our first year of marriage. He looked young. I looked awake. That's how I wanted to remember us before the edits began. Then I went upstairs and reopened the study. I hadn't touched it since the day I found the second will. This time, I entered not as a detective, not as a widow, but as a writer. I sat at the desk and opened a fresh notebook. The leather binding was stiff, the pages blank, waiting. And I began. Not a journal, not a letter, a memoir. Not about Charles, but about me. I started going on long morning walks again. At first, they were short, cautious steps around the neighborhood. Past houses where I used to drop off casseroles. Past fences Charles once helped paint during election seasons. Then farther, to the lake, to the edge of the city. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't dress for anyone. I just walked. Sometimes I thought about nothing. Sometimes I thought about everything. One afternoon, I passed by the old Robertson and Klein building, the firm where I began my career. The name had changed. The glass was newer, but the bones were the same. I stood across the street, watching young attorneys rush in and out, sleeves rolled up, eyes lit with ambition. I thought about how I used to be one of them. And I wasn't bitter, because something had shifted in me. Not a longing to go back, but a deep satisfaction that I had made my way forward and I was still standing. The next day, I found an old client on LinkedIn, a woman I once helped through a business acquisition gone wrong. We exchanged messages. She remembered me clearly. "You saved my company," she wrote. "I never forgot your clarity under pressure." And just like that, an opportunity opened. Part-time consulting, nothing formal, nothing overwhelming. Just enough to remind me, I never stopped being capable. I had just been asked to shrink for too long. Not anymore. On a Sunday afternoon, I attended a support group meeting, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to hear the echoes of other women who had once been silenced, and perhaps lend mine back in return. The room was warm, filled with mismatched chairs and soft voices. Some had lost spouses, some had survived infidelity, others had simply outgrown the roles they'd been told to inhabit. One woman, perhaps in her 70s, said something that stayed with me. "We're told that love is giving everything and asking for nothing. But real love, even for ourselves, starts with asking, 'What do I deserve?'" Heads nodded around the room. I sat quietly for most of it, but before we left, I shared my story, briefly. Not the court details, not the estate war, just the core truth. "I stayed quiet for decades," I said, "and when I finally spoke, I was afraid no one would believe me. But what I learned is, the person who needed to believe me most was me." There was a silence, and then someone reached for my hand. I didn't cry, I smiled, because in that room, surrounded by women who understood the weight of invisible labor and buried pain, I felt seen, really seen. On the anniversary of Charles's death, I didn't visit the grave. Instead, I hosted a small dinner at my home. 3 friends from the support group, Naomi, Marissa. We cooked together, laughed over too salty soup, passed around wine and old stories. No one asked about Charles. No one needed to. This evening wasn't about him. It was about life after him. Later, as the guests filtered out and the house grew quiet again, I walked barefoot to the garden. The crabapple tree I had once threatened to cut down, the one that nearly died 2 winters ago, had bloomed early that spring. Still blooming now. I looked up at its branches, lit softly by the porch light, and whispered, "I almost gave up on you." Then I smiled. Because it wasn't just about the tree. It was about me. I had survived abandonment, betrayal, legal battles, and something even heavier. Being unseen by the people I loved most. But I never stopped growing. I never stopped blooming. That night, as I turned off the lights, folded up the chairs, and set the table back in order, I felt peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from remembering who you are. I didn't walk upstairs to sleep as someone's widow. I went as Eleanor Gray, daughter, mother, fighter, and finally, free.